The snow didn't fall gently that night. It came sideways, a violent, screaming wind that tore across the valley like a wounded beast. Eliza Cooper wasn't running from a storm. She was running from a man. Her coat was thin, barely clinging to her shoulders, soaked with melted frost. Her boots, hand-me-downs from another lifetime, sank with every step into the blinding white. But she kept walking, one foot, then the other. For her kids. Nathan, 10, Laya, 8, and Ben, just 5. 3 small souls bundled in what warmth they could carry, their little legs trembling under weight no child should ever bear. Nathan said nothing, but his clenched jaw told a story. Laya clung to his arm, stumbling every few steps. Ben? Ben didn't talk anymore, and not since Bitter Hollow. He just whimpered softly, his tiny mittens frozen stiff, one hand always reaching for his mother's skirt like an anchor. They had nothing, not even a direction, just away. Away from Matthew Crowley, the man who once called himself husband and father. A man who rode off before the first snow hit, leaving behind a half-empty sack of flour and a bitter goodbye. You'll figure it out, Eliza. You always do. But survival isn't a skill. It's a sentence. And in the heart of that snowstorm, when her legs were burning and her lips cracked with every whispered encouragement to her children, Eliza wasn't sure she could take one more step. Then, a light. Faint, flickering, half swallowed by the snow. But real. A cabin, barely visible through the swaying pine trees and the white chaos that swallowed the trail behind them. Hope doesn't always roar. Sometimes it flickers, quietly in the distance. She knocked. Once. Twice. 3 times. Nothing. No answer. Just wind. Then, a creak. The door opened. And standing there was a man who looked like winter had shaped him out of wood and frost. Jonas Hale. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard dusted in gray and eyes like cold steel dulled by sorrow. He didn't say anything at first. Neither did Eliza. But what do you say when the only thing keeping you on your feet is fear? Behind her, the children huddled close, shivering violently. Jonas looked past her toward them, and something shifted in his jaw. He didn't ask questions. He simply stepped aside. Get in. That was it. No kindness in the words. Just survival. But in that moment it was enough. Eliza ushered the children inside. Ben collapsed against her legs. The warmth hit like a tidal wave. The crackle of firewood. The scent of pine smoke. Jonas moved quickly, dragging chairs closer to the fire, tossed blankets their way, heated water in a dented kettle. Ain't much, he muttered, pouring, steaming water into chipped mugs. Better than the cold, she nodded, her voice too raw to speak. He didn't pry. Didn't ask who she was, where she'd come from, or what she'd done to end up here. There's something powerful in the kind of silence that holds space instead of judgment. Jonas was a man who lived with ghosts. That much was obvious. But in opening that door, he'd made room for hers too. And maybe that's where all great stories begin. Not with declarations, not with fate, but with a door that opens, when it doesn't have to. What would you do if a stranger knocked in? The dead of winter? 3 children shivering at her side? Would you shut the door? Or would you, like Jonas, let them in? Even if it cost you your silence. Not every hero wears a badge. Sometimes they wear worn boots and carry wood for a stove that doesn't care who it warms. And sometimes, family begins not with blood, but with a knock in the night. This is how a new kind of home begins. One built not by walls, but by choice. And this is just the beginning. They didn't speak much that first night. Sometimes silence speaks loudest when you're finally safe. Jonas gave them blankets, heavy wool ones, rough but warm, and filled their cups with water boiled just enough to chase the cold out of their bones. He didn't ask questions, didn't ask for names or reasons, just pointed to the fire and said, "Sit, get warm." That was the kind of man he was, not friendly, not cruel, just still, like the trees outside. The kind that had seen storms before and knew better than to panic when one came. And Eliza? She was too tired to talk, too tired to explain how she ended up walking 3 days through a storm with 3 children in tow. Too tired to say the name Bitter Hollow, the place her husband had left them in like bags of flour too heavy to carry. But there was something in the way Jonas moved, wordless, brisk, that made it easier to breathe. She didn't know why he opened the door. Maybe he didn't either. Over the next few days the storm stayed, hanging low over the mountains, howling at the windows, demanding to be noticed. But inside that tiny cabin, something else was beginning. Something quieter, warmer. It started with small things. Eliza peeled frozen coats off her children's backs. Jonas set another log on the fire. She brewed thin stew from what little she had. He nodded, pulled up a chair. He sharpened his axe by the door. She swept the floor, humming low so the kids wouldn't hear the fear still rattling in her bones. And slowly they began to share the silence. He didn't say much, and neither did she. But they worked side by side, chipping at wood, clearing, snow from the roof, boiling water. He showed Nathan how to split logs without wasting strength. Nathan watched him like boys do when they see a man who might not run. Ben, the youngest, took to Jonas instantly, shadowed his every move like a duckling, asked 100 questions. Why do you carry that knife? Do bears live in the woods? Can I have an axe too? Jonas, to everyone's surprise, answered every single one. Patient, quiet. Never smiling, not really, but softer somehow in the presence of small, curious eyes. And Laya, she found wonder in the carvings Jonas made late at night, tiny animals shaped from scraps of firewood. One morning she woke to find a little fox beside her pillow. Its eyes were deep notches, its tail curled like it was listening. That's how healing begins, isn't it? Not with big declarations or grand gestures, but with a fox made of pine, left for a girl who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Eliza noticed. She saw the way Jonas handed Nathan a second pair of mittens, without a word. How he left his coat by the door when he knew she'd be the one fetching water. How he stirred the fire lower at night so the room wouldn't get too hot and wake the kids. There's a kind of intimacy in the mundane. In the sharing of chores, the folding of quilts, the quiet refill of an empty mug. She hadn't trusted anyone in a long time, and Jonas hadn't let anyone in for even longer. But when survival is no longer the only thing you share, warmth creeps in, and you start to realize that maybe, just maybe, the worst days didn't kill something in you. They cleared the way for something new. Jonas Hale wasn't trying to be a hero, but every time he handed Nathan the axe with gentle instruction, every time he answered Ben's impossible questions or watched Laya cradle that wooden fox like a treasure, he was building something, not a rescue, not a favor, but a foundation. Have you ever felt the presence of someone who didn't speak much but made you feel safe anyway? The kind of person who doesn't fix everything, but helps you carry it, not loudly, not with promises, but with presence. That's what this was. 2 strangers thrown together by storm and circumstance starting to discover the rarest kind of connection. One born not from blood or obligation, but from choice, from kindness without condition, from the quiet, almost unnoticed realization that we is stronger than I, and as the snow howled outside and the fire crackled low. In that quiet cabin, something real began to grow. Not just safety, not just survival, but family, in its earliest form. Some storms don't howl through trees. They wear boots, ride horses, and carry papers stamped with the weight of the law. It had been quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in when a family, even a broken one, starts to believe they might have made it through. The fire burned steady, the children laughed again. Eliza could finally sleep without one eye open, but peace never comes without testing its walls. That morning they heard the hoofbeats before they saw the men. 4 riders cutting through the snow, too confident, too straight-backed to be drifters. Jonas stepped outside first, shoulders square, eyes narrowed. The first man off his horse was tall, lean, and wore a coat too fine for this part of the country. His smile wasn't warm, it was familiar. Arrogant, oil-slicked. A smile Eliza hadn't seen in months, but one her body remembered immediately. Matthew Crowley, the man who once promised to build a future with her, and then rode off into a storm, leaving behind 3 children and a lie that said, "You'll figure it out." Now he was back, with 2 hired men and worse, the sheriff from Glenrock, a man whose loyalty could be bought for the price of a new saddle. Eliza stood in the doorway of the cabin as Matthew approached, her children behind her, confused but watching. Jonas didn't move, didn't say a word, but stood like the ridge itself, unshakable. "I've come for my children," Matthew said, voice smooth as ever, lifting a folded legal document from his coat. "By law, they're mine." And just like that, the air shifted. The storm outside hadn't ended. It had just changed form. Eliza's face went pale. The kind of pale that doesn't come from cold, but from knowing just how powerless a piece of paper can make you feel when you've got no money, no lawyer, no voice that the law listens to. She knew the truth, that he had abandoned them, that he hadn't written, hadn't cared, hadn't even looked back. But the law had its own eyes, and they weren't watching mothers like her. Eliza whispered, "What am I supposed to do?" Her voice cracked like dry wood. "He has the law, I have nothing." And then Jonas spoke. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it cut through the fear like a blade through frost. "You don't have to fight him alone." Eliza turned to him, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands trembling. She didn't even know what she was asking for. Help? Strength? A miracle? But Jonas wasn't hesitating. "I've seen men like him before," he said. "Men who think papers make them powerful. But they don't know what real strength looks like. You kept these children alive. You carried them through a blizzard. You built something out of nothing." He stepped forward, eyes burning now, not with rage, but with something steadier, fiercer. "He thinks you'll be scared. He's counting on you going quiet." Jonas looked at her, firm and unwavering, "But we're not going quiet. Not tomorrow. Not ever again. And maybe that's what courage really is. Not charging into danger with fire in your chest, but standing still when everything in you wants to run. Planting your feet and saying, 'No, not this time.'" Eliza took a breath that rattled all the way down to her soul. Then she nodded, just once. Solid. Certain. "Then we stand together." Have you ever had someone stand beside you when you felt the smallest? Not speak for you, not fix it all. Just stand there quietly, fully, without stepping back. Because that's what Jonas did. He didn't have a badge. He didn't have a courtroom. But he had a line he wasn't willing to let anyone cross. And when Matthew Crowley came back, not as a husband, not as a father, but as a threat, Jonas stood in the doorway between him and the only family he'd come to care about. "For family," he had said, "I'd do more." And sometimes that's what defines a man. Not his name, not his past, but the moment he draws a line and means it. This was no longer just about custody or law. This was about choosing not to live in fear anymore. About refusing to hand your life over to someone who only shows up when it's convenient to control it. And in that moment, before the fight even began, something changed. Eliza wasn't just surviving anymore. She was standing. Not because the storm had passed, but because someone had finally said, "You don't have to weather it alone." Some fights aren't won with fists. They're won when someone takes a step forward and everyone else refuses to step back. The next day, the snow was still thick on the ground, the wind sharp as ever. But inside the cabin, something had changed. Eliza wasn't pacing anymore. She wasn't trembling. Her fear hadn't disappeared, but it had hardened into something else. Resolve. Because when someone threatens your children, your home, your fragile hope for peace, you don't get the luxury of fear. You only get one choice: stand or lose. Everything. By noon, they heard the sound again. Horses. 4 of them this time. Matthew Crowley had returned, just as he promised. But he didn't come alone. This time, he brought the law. Sheriff Tate rode beside him, a man with more coin in his pocket than conscience in his chest. The kind of lawman who looked the other way, as long as someone greased the right wheels. Matthew didn't knock. He didn't even wait. He stepped into the clearing like he owned the snow beneath his boots. "Eliza," he called, voice raised, smugness riding every syllable. "I'm here like I said. Time to bring my children home." But the thing is, they were already home. Eliza stepped out onto the porch. Her back was straight, her voice steady. "They are home," she said. "And they're not going anywhere." Matthew's smile thinned. He motioned to the sheriff, who dismounted and pulled out a folded paper with deliberate slowness. "Custody order, signed and sealed." His voice was flat, legal, lifeless. He started to read. "Eliza Cooper, you are hereby ordered to relinquish." That's when Jonas stepped forward. "That's enough," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the clearing like a crack of thunder. He moved between Matthew and the cabin, arms crossed, eyes hard. He didn't raise a weapon, he didn't need to. He was the line. "I know what you are, Crowley," he said, voice steady as bedrock. "You left them to die. I didn't." Matthew laughed, sharp, bitter. "You think this is your fight? You're just some nobody hiding in the woods." Jonas didn't flinch. "You think blood makes you a father? Blood didn't keep them warm. Didn't teach them how to split wood. Didn't hold them when they cried. You gave them nothing. And now you want to call it yours." It was the kind of silence that followed a truth too big to argue with. And then, something happened. Voices. From the edge of the trees, a group of people bundled against the cold, walking into the clearing, one by one. Stepping into view, Mrs. Webb, Pastor Connor, old Doc Briggs, farmers, mothers, shopkeepers, people who'd seen Eliza at her lowest, who'd handed her bread, mended her shawl, watched her kids grow steadier each week in this new life. They didn't shout. They didn't make speeches. Mrs. Webb simply stepped forward and said, "We stand with her." Pastor Connor nodded. She raised those children with grace when no one else would. And just like that, the balance shifted. Matthew turned to Sheriff Tate, expecting support. But the sheriff hesitated, his authority unraveling fast. "Crowley, this paper's only good if someone's willing to enforce it." You could see, at the moment Matthew realized this wasn't just about a piece of paper anymore. It was about people. About eyes that had seen through his charm. About a town that chose to protect one of their own. Matthew's face twisted. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "You think a few farmers and widows can stop me?" Jonas didn't move. "I think you're already stopped." And just like that, Matthew's bravado broke. He crumpled the paper in his fist, cursed under his breath, and stormed back to his horse. He didn't look back this time. The sheriff followed, quieter now, like a man who'd finally realized which way the wind was blowing. No one cheered. There was no applause, just the sound of boots in snow, people slowly turning back, returning to their homes. But Eliza knew what had just happened. Sometimes the strongest walls are made not from stone, but from people who decide to show up. Have you ever witnessed that moment when a community decides who they are, not by what they say, but by what they won't allow? It's powerful, it's rare, and it's real. Because the truth is, injustice doesn't always look like war. Sometimes it shows up in a nice coat and a legal stamp. It counts on people being too tired, too poor, too afraid to fight back. But when one voice says enough, and others echo it, that's when things change. That day, Eliza didn't win because she had power. She won because she had people. She stood her ground. And when she did, she found she wasn't standing alone. And maybe that's the real definition of home. Not just four walls and a roof, but a place where, when the wolves come, someone opens the door and says, "Not today." Some seasons don't change overnight. Spring, especially the kind that follows a brutal winter, arrives slowly, tentatively, like it's asking permission to hope again. Around the cabin, the first signs were small. Snow started melting along. The porch steps running in thin silver streams across thawed earth. Trees once stripped bare and brittle began to bud, tiny green promises pushing through bark that had weathered months of silence. And inside that little cabin, something just as fragile was beginning to grow. There was no more storm. No more. Matthew Crowley knocking at the door. What lingered now was something else. Something gentler. Warm mornings. The sound of laughter returning. First tentative, then steady. The smell of bread rising in the oven. Pine smoke curling from the chimney and boots by the door no longer damp from panic. Just mud from working the garden. Jonas and Eliza didn't speak about love right away, but love has a way of speaking, without words. It was in the way Jonas taught Nathan how to knot a rope, patient and proud as the boy's hands finally got it right. It was in the quiet hours Eliza spent patching worn mittens, now with steadier hands. The way she'd glance up and catch Jonas watching her, not like a man who owed her something, but like a man who'd started to see her as home. They moved, through each day not as guests, not as survivors, but as something new. A family not born but built. One morning, Nathan came up behind Jonas while he was whittling a piece of wood by the window. He stood there for a long moment, just watching. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Is it okay if I call you Pa?" Jonas didn't answer with words. He simply reached out and pulled the boy into a hug. A quiet, unshakable yes. There's a kind of healing that doesn't come from time. It comes from choice. From showing up. From being there when someone calls you something they've never said before because they need it to be true. And that's what this became. Jonas taught Nathan how to sharpen tools, fix the roof, plant seeds that would one day feed them all. Eliza and Laya tended the soil outside, their hands stained with earth and joy. Ben? Ben ran wild, chasing frogs and blowing on a wooden whistle Jonas carved just for him. Sharp, joyful notes echoing across. The yard like laughter rediscovered, you could feel it. The shift. The cabin wasn't just shelter now. It was memory in the making. It was muddy footprints, shared meals, inside jokes, and chores done together without complaint. It was safety, yes. But more than that, it was belonging. Eliza had once believed she was only passing through. That this stop in the woods was temporary. A pause before the next survival chapter. But now, when she looked out across the yard and saw Jonas teaching Laya how to tie a swing, or heard Ben humming beside the creek, or felt Nathan's steady presence by her side, she realized something had changed. They hadn't just landed here, they had rooted. And Jonas, quiet, steady Jonas, who once believed his life would always be silent and still, began to smile more. Not wide, not loud, but real. The kind that sits behind the eyes steady as sunrise. One evening, Eliza stood beside him as the sun set gold across the snow-melted hills. Her voice soft, almost uncertain, she asked, "Are you happy?" Jonas didn't speak right away. He looked at her, then out across the land, then back again. "I never thought I'd want noise," he said. "But now I want everything you bring through that door, even the noise, especially the noise. What makes a place feel like home to you? Is it the roof overhead, the silence inside, or is it the people who say, 'I choose you,' every day?" Sometimes we think love has to arrive grand, on horseback, with fire and thunder. But maybe it shows up in a garden you plant together. In a child whispering "Pa" for the first time, in muddy boots by the fire and someone sitting beside you long after the storm has passed. Because when survival fades and routine settles in, we don't just rebuild lives. We rewrite what family means. And in that little cabin carved out of snow and silence, love didn't just happen. It grew, slow, soft, and stronger than winter itself. Some ghosts don't haunt houses. They ride back into your life on horseback years after you thought they were gone, not looking for forgiveness, just control. It was late spring when Matthew Crowley returned, not with a sheriff this time, not with riders or papers, just himself, alone. His coat dusty, his boots worn, and that arrogant swagger he always carried. Gone. Jonas heard the hoofbeats first, slow, dragging, almost reluctant. He stepped out onto the porch without a word. Behind him, the cabin door stood open, sunlight spilling across the floor, and through that light, Eliza stood still, steady, watching. This wasn't fear now. This was closure. Matthew dismounted, boots squelching softly in the mud. He looked older, thinner, smaller somehow. "I came for them," he said, his voice more gravel than charm now. "They're mine." He was talking about the children. His children. By blood, maybe. But that was all he'd ever given them. A name they no longer wanted. Jonas didn't even raise his voice. "Last time I checked," he said, calm but cold, "you gave them up the day you left them in Bitter Hollow with nothing but a lie and a bag of flour." Matthew sneered, trying to summon something of his old fire. "You think you can play house with my wife and kids? Pretend you're the man here now?" That's when Eliza stepped out. She didn't raise her voice either, but her words cut clean. "You were never a husband, and you were never a father. You don't get to come back now and call them yours. You left us to die." Behind her, the children stood in the doorway. Nathan, now taller and stronger than the boy Matthew once ignored, stepped forward. His voice didn't shake. "You're not my pa. Jonas is." Leah followed, clutching her carved fox. "He tucks us in. He listens. You never did." And even Ben, sweet, shy Ben, nodded, his voice barely a whisper. But still, it reached Matthew like thunder. We already have a dad. There's something sacred about being claimed by children. Not because they have to, but because they choose to. And for a man like Matthew, who always thought love was something owed, not earned, it was a mirror he couldn't stand to face. He looked at Eliza one last time. And maybe, for a second, there was something behind his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or just the realization that what he lost was never coming back. Without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away. This time, he didn't look back. What does it mean to truly let go of the past? Not just survive it, not just run from it, but stare it in the face and say, "You don't get to define me anymore." For Eliza, this wasn't just about Matthew. It was about all the moments she'd been told she wasn't enough. All the years she carried guilt that never belonged to her. And all the nights she stayed silent because no one had ever stood up for her, until Jonas. Until she stood up for herself. That's the thing about healing. It rarely happens in the absence of pain. It happens after it, in the quiet resolve to never go back. When Matthew disappeared over the ridge, there were no tears, no applause, just a door that didn't need to slam shut, because it had already closed long ago. And inside that cabin, where love had taken root and laughter had returned, the family he'd tried to break stood whole, untouched. Because this wasn't his story anymore. It never really was. Sometimes love doesn't come charging in with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quiet, gentle, worn around the edges, but solid in a way that makes you breathe deeper. The storms had passed, the snow had melted into soft earth, and life at the Yao cabin wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about living. The days began with the scent of bread in the oven, kids chasing each other through dew-soaked grass, and Eliza humming a tune no one recognized, but everyone felt. Jonas would sit on the porch with a mug of black coffee, carving something with slow, steady hands. A bird, a fox, a horse, little pieces of wood turned into memory. The evenings were even softer, laughter around the fire, the warmth of quilts stitched with more care than thread, and the sound of tiny feet thumping across the wood floors just before bedtime. Always too much noise and never enough of it. Jonas once thought he'd live his whole life in silence. That peace meant solitude. But that was before Eliza, before the children. One night after the kids had gone to bed, Eliza sat across from him near the hearth, her hair loose, her hands still dusted with flour. She looked at him the way someone looks at a place they finally decided to stay. She said, "They're happy here." Jonas nodded. "They should be." She hesitated, then added, "But are you?" Jonas set his knife down. The room was still, but not empty. "For a long time," he said, voice rough with something fragile. "I thought this cabin was enough. Just me, just the quiet. But then you came in and brought all this noise." She smiled, half shy, half proud. Jonas reached across the table, taking her hand. "I want everything you brought with you," he said. "Even the noise. Especially the noise. Have you ever had someone love the parts of you thought were too messy, too loud, too much? Not despite them, but because of them? That's what this became. Not a second chance, but a first real one, because love like this, it isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It's about staying, choosing, showing up every single day when it would be easier not to. Jonas wasn't a father by blood. He was something more. He was chosen. By Nathan, who now called him Pa without hesitation. By Laya, who waited by the window for him every evening. By Ben, who never let go of his hand in a crowd. And Eliza, who had every reason to never trust again, trusted him with everything. Not because he saved her, but because he stood beside her long after the danger was gone. That's the kind of love that lasts, the kind that doesn't need a rescue, just roots. By summer, the garden behind the cabin bloomed. So did something else, a rhythm, a home, a life built not from what was given, but what was chosen. Jonas, who had spent years cutting wood in silence, now found music in footsteps, in laughter, in the clatter of dishes and the squeak of a swing Nathan hung by hand. Eliza no longer wondered if she'd make it through another day. Now she wondered what joy the next one might bring. Some families are born. Others are built, slowly, intentionally, with patience and love. This family, they weren't just survivors anymore. They were whole. And for the first time, Jonas Hale looked at the 4 people sitting around his fire and thought, "This is it. This is home. Not because of blood, but because of choice. Because of love. And because even in the harshest winter, something beautiful can grow."